Uh, Firstly, the mandatory part, thanking the organizer for inviting me here. And but really. So I'm Sugoto. I'm from Cultivation of Science, Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, Kolkata. Uh, there are certain difficulties here. For example, I am an experimentalist among most of the theoreticians here. And also the kind of thing I do is somewhat like interdisciplinary, more based on materials. So there won't be any superconductivity, there won't be any DMFT. So just relax, simple things. Surely, it will be simple for everybody. Actually, I'm afraid that it might appear to be that putting a vegetarian dish in front of the non-vegetarians, and they might find it. I'll still try to cook a good vegetarian food, but it should not be other way around. A half-cooked piece of beef in front of a vegetarian is killing. I wouldn't try that. So anyway, I will probably talk about two stories, and the whole thing has been done majorly by all these people. My former PhD student and present PhD students, Somnath, Tanushree, and Abhishek. Then Vijay Singh and Indra Das Gupta did some part of the calculation. I do collaborate with theoreticians largely. Then Carlo did or on the XNS and XZAPS kind of experiments. Then Shantu and Tanushree Das Gupta again for some theory part. And then other experimentalists for neutron diffractions, which I will not show. So the main part that I will try to emphasize on is some unusual cases of metal-oxygen covalency. Now I'll start with a very simple description of one slide about covalency, which would probably appear very irrelevant or redundant for the seniors, but mostly for the students. So this statement is clear. Covalency in metal-oxygen bond is very important. And I try to show why and how. The point is that the degree of covalency against the degree of ionicity of the metal-oxygen bond. So when I say that, every metal-oxygen bond that we know in solids have this kind of a partial effects. For example, most of the time, we do things very casually. Something like if I ask somebody, what is the oxidation state of titanium in SRTiO3? I guess everybody will say, okay, there are 3 oxygen, 2 minus, that's 6 minus, strontium is 2 plus, so do a plus minus calculation, and titanium is 4 plus. When we do that, we make some simple assumptions. The assumptions are strontium has given out 2 electrons completely. Every oxygen has taken up 2 electrons and became oxygen 2 minus. And that's a pure ionic picture. But in reality, what one often observes, that it's not the case. Means there are certain charge redistribution. You will probably find some charge density on titanium out of the Ti4 plus D0 configuration. Out of that, you will probably have some reduced charge in oxygen and things like that. And that's the covalency part that comes in. Now, in any metal-oxygen bond, what is the degree of covalency and what's the degree of ionicity? That would depend upon the position of the metal in the periodic table, its oxidation state, and more importantly, its coordination environment. And I'll try to show you why. Now, covalency of a bond is optimized when orbitals on neighboring atoms, in this case metal and oxygen, have favorable spatial and energetic overlap. This is mandatory. This has to happen. Because of the absence of this, largely, in case of oxygen, the only orbital that we talk about are oxygen 2p orbitals. These are the only ones which has these favorable conditions to undergo a covalent interaction. The other 1s and 2s orbitals you can forget about mostly. That's because of this overlapping problem. For example, if you look at the metals now, other than the transition metals, look at the alkaline earth or rare earth metals. What happens is the s orbitals, they are actually quite high in energy compared to the oxygen 2p orbitals. As a result, there is very little covalent linkage. So the bonding, anti-bonding levels almost do not form. You can say, or they almost remain at the same level of metal and the oxygen. Oxygen and the metal. So often the metal does, it gives up the two or whatever number of electrons to the oxygen, stabilizes the system, and it's basically ionic. So for these non-transition metals, most of the time the bonding is ionic in nature. However, the situation changes for transition metals. For transition metals, the spatial extension of s and p orbitals are rather large, and as a result, what happens is there is a strong overlap. You have a largely stabilized bonding level and largely destabilized antibonding level. So both of these levels are quite far away from the Fermi energy. However, the d of the transition metal, d orbitals of the transition metal, they interact. They give a moderately destabilized antibonding and stabilized bonding levels. And these are the levels which remain close to the Fermi energy and mostly influence their properties. This is precisely the reason why for transition metal oxides, we only talk about transition metal D and the oxygen P overlap. So that's precisely a basic of covalency part. And now I jump to the cases that I would like to show you. The first case is this. So unlike many people here, I myself try to create disturbances in the system. That means I try to plan systems. Here what I tried, the compound is barium cobalt oxychloride. That's basically barium cobaltate, BaCOO3. And the previous speaker already said that in presence of barium, most of the time your tolerance factor is high and you get a 6H or hexagonal structure stabilized. The plan that I had was that it's the oxygen that makes the network, the anionic network. Can we make certain disturbances in the anionic network somewhere by replacing oxygen with some other anion? This is something that we often do with the cations. Here I'm trying to do this with anions, make disturbances in the anionic matrix or anionic network and see how they affect. So in order to do that, the two compounds that I have looked at are these. I mean, maybe it's comfortable for the chemist. For physicists, it's probably kind of repelling to look these big formulas and like that. But actually, these are not really very complicated. It's basically you take BaCOO3, multiply that by 5. You get Ba5CO5O15. Take out 2 oxygen, put 1 chlorine in, and that's what this is. The other one is multiply that by 6. So it's basically modification of BaCOO3. And of course, the structure says that it's not cubic. It's some kind of hexagonal structure with rather complex distributions. Like you have octahedrons, cobalt oxygen octahedra, sharing a face. And they are connected to the next set of octahedra via a couple of tetrahedra, cobalt oxygen tetrahedra. Okay? Now, unlike what I wanted to do, I had put in chlorine in place of oxygen. I thought I put in, but it actually did not replace an oxygen. What it did is chlorine stayed somewhere here separately. This is chlorine. It did not get involved into any bonding with any of the cobalt or anything. It remained separate. Now this is particularly the level that I would call BaOCl layer, basically because there is a oxygen, there is a chlorine, and these are the barium. So this is the BaOCl layer. Now the chlorine really did not substitute oxygen. It did get into the lattice, but did not do anything else. Now the kind of description in ionic description I gave for strontium titanate, following exactly the same rule, people suggested that these would be the oxidation states. The octahedral cobalts would all be cobalt 3+. The tetrahedral cobalts will all be cobalt 4+ in both the cases. And actually you can do the same plus minus algebra and you will find that the charge balance is perfect. So this was the starting point. Now what I'll try to show you is a small piece from here and try to draw your attention to is this. is the same thing that I have shown before, but only a couple of octahedra shown sharing a face connected to a tetrahedra. Of course, there are other tetrahedra here and other octahedrons here, but forget about them. So that's an expanded view of a part of the lattice. The interesting part is, I would ask you to look at the bond lengths. This I note as cobalt 1. There are 3 types of cobalt in this particular case. This is cobalt 1, this is cobalt 2, and this I call cobalt 3. Look at this cobalt 1O1 bond, that's 1.96 angstrom. This is cobalt 1O2 bond, that's 1.92 angstrom, and these two are 1.9 angstrom. So all the bond lengths are of the range of 1.9 to 1.96. Now if you go there, the bond lengths have reduced drastically. Cobalt 3 O1, so this is also O1, this is also O1. Cobalt 3 O1 bond length is 1.83 angstrom, and this is O4, that's 1.79 angstrom. So suddenly, in case of tetrahedron, you find that all oxygens are coming closer, making shorter bonds. We are trying to find out why, and then we went to the literature and found something strange. Actually, it might be known to many, but it was certainly not known to me. So I give an analogy here. This is simple manganese oxide, MnO. Manganese is in 2+ oxidation state. Simple crystal structure like sodium chloride. All manganese is 6 coordinated, making an octahedra, and these octahedra are corner connected along all the 3 directions. The simplest possible structure we know. Compared to that, I will show you another structure, which is the structure of potassium permanganate. What's that? Here the manganese is in 7+ oxidation state. Potassium is completely ionic. It just gives out its electron, sits here, does nothing else, and you are left with a MnO4 tetrahedra, which are these. And this manganese is 7+. The point is, the manganese oxygen bond lengths are found out to be this. DMNO is 1.71 angstrom, while this one is 2.22 angstrom. A huge difference of the same manganese oxygen bond. You can argue, of course, that manganese oxidation states are different, but still that does not explain probably that large a variation. In fact, then certain work, theoretical work, what it says is this: the bonding in this series of complexes, here the complex is the MnO4 minus permanganate complex, is characterized by their strong capability of electron redistribution. What's most shocking is, as a consequence, the formal charge at the metal center of 7+ in MnO4 minus is reduced to about 2+. So the nominal Mn7+ O4, it seems manganese goes to Mn2+. How does that reduction happen? Of course, the reduction happens because oxygen gives out lots of electron to the manganese. Manganese gets reduced, and these oxygens have lots of hole in them. And there is a huge covalency because of that this happens, and that's precisely the reason why the manganese oxygen bond lengths become so small. Now the question that we ask, in our system that I showed you, we have both cobalt in octahedral coordination as well as in tetrahedral coordination. And we did find that these lengths are much smaller than these lengths, not as different as manganese oxygen, but still quite different. Whether something of that sort is actually happening or not. Then Professor Tanushree Saha Dasgupta's group did some DFT calculations and gave us this number. Now I remind you once again that the nominal expectation was this is cobalt 4+, this is cobalt 3+, these two are cobalt 3+. Here for easy reference, I have just given the expected moments that would come if you have cobalt 2+ in high spin and low spin, cobalt 3+, high spin and low spin, and cobalt 4+, high spin and low spin. Now look at this table now. First, I will ask you to look at this. This is cobalt 3, that is this particular cobalt, cobalt 3. That gives a moment of 2.956, very close to cobalt 2+ high spin. The expectation was cobalt 4+, what we are getting is cobalt 2+, close to it. So very similar to what was observed for permanganate cases. Actually, now you look at the other cobalts, cobalt 1 here, and cobalt 2, you see the numbers are, moments are 0.3 and 0.5, something in between these. This one being closer to 0 and this one more away from 0. So this is probably closer to cobalt 3 plus and this one being closer to cobalt 4 plus. So that's what happens. Then when we did X-ray absorption near its spectroscopy measurement on cobalt, this is a cobalt K age, and what you find that this particular age of cobalt in XNS is kind of a fingerprint of its oxidation state. And if you can actually see that the black and the red are the results from our compound, and the blue one is the result from CO3O4. That's a 2 plus 3 plus mixture that we know. And it matches, the age matches quite well in energy. That essentially says that this calculation, what it says, that this would be 2 plus and these would be something like between 3 plus and 4 plus, looks quite true. But if this happens, like a permanganate case, what do you expect is these oxygens to be having lots of hole, and that's precisely what happens. Oxygens developed a lot of hole, 0.3, 0.4, quite large for an oxygen, very, very large for an oxygen. So what I conclude from here is that in these compounds, this particular tetrahedra is doing something strange where these oxygens are accommodating lots of hole, and this cobalt is getting reduced from 4 plus to 2 plus. Now the question that we wanted to ask is that what's the manifestation of it? There is a lot of covalency in the cobalt oxygen O4 octahedra, tetrahedra. What would be the manifestation of it? What we tried to do is this. If I want to, the point is that if I want to look at the manifestation of covalency, I have to look at either this one or these ones or this one. How do I look at that? Within a compound, how do I look at a particular oxygen? I cannot. I can do an oxygen-specific experiment, but that will look at all the oxygens available. I can try to look the same for the cobalt, but that all the cobalt will be seen. How can I only look these? So then what we try to do is this. What we try to do is that first look at this structure and look at this BaOCl layer. What we thought that let's do a chlorine is an unique atom sitting at this plane, which is nowhere else other than this plane. Do a chlorine KH XNS or XAPS, look at the local structure and find out what happens to the O4. At least we can look at O4, that particular covalency. And that's what we precisely did with polarized X-ray absorption on these small, tiny single crystals at X, Y, and Z directions, and these are the results of XNS and XAPS. I don't have the time to really get into the detail of the experiments, but I'll jump into the results that we saw. But before going into the result, I will tell you briefly what is already there in the literature. This picture is nothing but a picture of this layer with a top view. So this green sphere are these bariums. These violet spheres are these oxygen, chlorines. And this oxygen is this. I mean, this looks somewhat strange. What the diffraction told us is that unfortunately this particular oxygen does not really sit here where it is expected to sit. Instead, what it does, it finds 3 possible symmetric positions around the mean position and have a shared stay. 1/3 stay here, 1/3 stay here, 1/3 stay here. XRD being, or diffraction being an average probe, that's the way it's defined. This oxygen is staying 1/3 here, 1/3 here, and 1/3 here. Even certain calculations showed exactly the similar charge density for this particular oxygen. Now, how this can happen? This can happen in 2 ways. One way is within the experimental time scale of diffraction, I mean diffraction experimental time scale, within that, if this particular oxygen is fast moving between these 3 positions, diffraction will look like this, will give you this information. Or there is another possibility. Another possibility is that oxygens are not moving within that time scale, they are static. But at one site, oxygen is fixed here. In some other site, it's fixed there, and in somewhere, it's there. So in an average, it says, okay, 1/3 here, 1/3 here, 1/3 here. Now, this is the problem of an average probe. But when we did chlorine, when I did, I would like to mention here that it appears to us that these oxygens are all trying to move towards the chlorine. These particular 3 positions that it has taken, it's taking because it tries to go towards the chlorine. Probably the answer is simple. We have already shown these oxygens are having lots of holes. So that essentially means it's effectively somewhat positive. And it's trying to go towards the Cl minus to stabilize itself. Now, when we do the exurbs, there is an advantage. What we are doing is chlorine exurbs. That means we are looking at the around the chlorine. Now, if it is static, the chlorine will always find an asymmetric triangle around it. These are the 3 oxygens possible. Now, if the positioning of the oxygens is static, then chlorine will always find an asymmetric triangle around it, unlike this symmetric triangle. So by exurbs, I can find out whether this distortion is static or dynamic. If it is dynamic, it will still find it 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And exurb says it's static. It's static within the experimental time scale of exurbs. Another very interesting point to note. Every oxygen, O4, has possibility to take up any of the 3 positions, any of the 3. So now looking at this picture, you can actually make many triangles. You can actually draw many triangles based on random freezing of the oxygens. You can have a smaller ones, all the oxygens being closer, you can have a smaller one, and many possibilities. But our experiment says no. It does not take up all these possibilities. It takes up only one single possibility, and that possibility is this. What is this possibility? Every chlorine is finding one oxygen closer to it. That means this chlorine is finding, let's say, this oxygen sitting here. The other 2 are invariably away. So you have an asymmetric triangle, which is this blue dashed line. That's the reality. Every chlorine tries to pull in one oxygen. What's the net result of that? That's the average scenario. I go for a static positioning, and I have a situation like this. Every chlorine pulls in one oxygen around it. Every chlorine, all of them, like this. Now it is easy to understand that when this happens, this is going to create local dipoles. So you are having lots of local dipoles formed in the layer, in the BaOCl plane. Of course, they are randomly directed. As a result, you will probably not find the net polarization, but the dipoles would anyway be there. And then using or having these particular distortions in, if the calculations are repeated, we find, I'll not go into the detail of it, what we find is that this particular oxygen takes up even more hole. That means by going towards the chlorine, this oxygen is ready to take up more hole. So it's stabilizing by going towards the oxygen, making a chlorine-oxygen pair, smaller dipoles all in the plane, but randomly directed. There could be another interesting manifestation of it. That is this. XRD being a faster probe looked at average. Exurbs gave something like a static distortion, but all of them are very fast to connect the 2 tetrahedral cobalt. So when the cobalt-oxygen-cobalt bonds are fluctuating and when they get frozen, there will be an indication on magnetism too, and that's precisely what you find. So I would like to call it a covalency-driven magnetodielectric in a way. So that's one story of covalency, and actually I'm running out of time. I'm kind of scared, so I'll quickly go take 5 minutes and finish up the rest of the part. I'll actually take 5 minutes. These are on double perovskites, a different class of compounds. I have written lots of names and lots of complicated things, which I will not talk about. In fact, all these compounds doesn't really matter. There is only one single phenomena that's there in all of them, and that's precisely what I'm trying to tell you. Now, this is double perovskite. I'm sure that the seniors here, everybody knows what double perovskite is, but again, for the students, a small description. This small cube that one can see here is a perovskite cube. At the corners, you have the transition metals, vanadium or molybdenum, the yellow and the green spheres. At the body-centered positions, you have these A-side cations sitting, and at the edge centers, you have the oxygens, making this be VO6 or MO6 kind of octahedra. Now, if these V and MO are ordered like this, one after another, just one after another, you can immediately see to describe the unit cell, you have to double it. As one small cube isn't enough. You have to double it, and that's the name double perovskite. The point is that if you do not have this ordering, the name double perovskite does not actually make much of a sense. Here, the compounds that I have shown you, that has a transition metal vanadium, another transition metal molybdenum, two of them. But we have two A site 2, and that can also order. In fact, there are complicated reviews and different types of ordering are shown. So in our compound, we have taken very complicated scenario where we have two B sites which can order in different ways, two A sites which can order in different ways. So it's a complicated combination that might be there. I will not spend time on that. We still wanted to look at the ordering actually, the nature of ordering. Again, we did molybdenum KH exhaust. And what did we find? Let's say we are doing molybdenum exhaust. That means we are looking at molybdenum local structure. Let's say this is molybdenum. And the system is perfectly ordered like this. If it is so, every molybdenum is going to find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 vanadium around it. No molybdenum. No molybdenum will find another molybdenum at the nearest level. 0. But if we have completely disordered, that means each of this sphere has a possibility, each of this site will be 50% occupied by vanadium, 50% by molybdenum. If it happens that way, then statistically every molybdenum will find 3 vanadium and 3 molybdenum. So the possibilities are spans 0 molybdenum to 3 molybdenum. Experiment tells you every molybdenum finds 3.6 molybdenum, more than that. Even bigger problem, I have La and Sr, and there are 8 small cubes, so 4 La and 4 Sr is expected around it, and molybdenum finds 5.8 Sr. For some reason, molybdenum finds more molybdenum and more strontium around it, some kind of a microscopic phase separation. I draw a hypothetical structure. Why is it so? It's again for the covalency. That's nearly my last slide. I already said in the beginning, for the alkali and alkaline earth metals, they are mostly ionic. So let's look at charge density of strontium. You can see that it's purely ionic. It has given out its electrons and actually doing nothing else with the neighboring elements. But that's not the case with lanthanum, surprisingly. Lanthanum is getting involved into some kind of covalency with this neighboring oxygen. And as this oxygen has to share electron with this lanthanum, this particular oxygen doesn't want a strongly covalent atom here. It had two possibilities, vanadium and molybdenum. Of course, molybdenum is more covalent. So it prefers to have molybdenum here, not vanadium. It prefers to have vanadium here, not molybdenum. As a result, lanthanum always pulls in vanadium close to it and left strontium and molybdenum aside. As a result, that's what experimentally that we have seen. This is also something not new. This is like a GDFeO3 kind of a distortion. I don't have time, so the conclusion is I have shown you two different cases where a tetrahedral covalency created strange structural modulations. In another case, the smaller A-site cation in double perovskite gave a different kind of ordering. So the point that I tried to establish here, this metal-oxygen covalent linkage in these oxides often does strange things, and unless you are aware of it, you ought to get into a wrong conclusion. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Questions? Antoine?
So I would like to ask more about the physical effects of these oxygen holes. So you have described what effects they can have on the structure, right?
Yes.
With this shrinking of the bonds and so on. But could we also imagine that these oxygen holes are lead to interesting electronic properties. It would seem, for example, that it's almost a realization of negative U, because
Yes.
you have almost negative charge
Yes.
transfer energy,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So can one make superconductors out of these oxygen hole systems?
I would like to, but I mean, I seriously don't know. I mean, some experiments are planned. I mean, I do not know. First of all, these moments that I have shown you are calculated results. It's good to do oxygen XMCD kind of measurements and check out moments on oxygens in reality and see that whether this is true. I mean, I being an experimentalist, I tend to believe on the spectrums more than the numbers. So first I have to...
Are there metallic systems that
No.
have oxygen holes?
No, not metallic system. It has a gap, but it's very small. I have done photoemission studies. It looks a very soft gap. Her calculation actually gives a band gap of something like only 0.1 electron volt, not more than that. In principle, yes. I have not tried. These are possibilities which we are actually looking into. I mean, this is a very fresh thing. I have not even communicated anything.
Are there any more questions? Yes, please, on the back.
So coming back to Sino's question, when this chlorine attracts oxygen, so there are two kind of computation. One is the elastic energy,
Yes,
and the other is the ion-ion interaction that chlorine.
yes.
So what makes you sure that the ion-ion interaction wins over the elastic energy? Because I assume that the moment you introduce the distortion, the lattice parameter itself might change and some kind of structural phase transition can happen also.
So the thing is, the answer right now from the theory point of view, I can tell you that when we increase this distortion by hand, by DFT calculations, you can do it. You can make the movements different by hand. When you do that, what we normally always found is that when it goes more towards the chlorine, it's able to accommodate more hole. This particular oxygen can accommodate more hole if it is dragged more towards the chlorine. So that's precisely the reason why I believe it is supposed to be that way. That it's mostly driven by the ion-ion interactions.
More questions? I have a question on this, again, on this material. Have you done a study on the temperature? For instance, you are talking about these dimers of chlorine
Yes.
and oxygen. Did you do, for instance, PDF analysis so that one can see these dimers and especially this
I understand.
distribution of dimers and how they evolve in temperature?
No, I did not do a PDF analysis distribution function, no. The only thing I did is this EXAFS kind of things, which is also kind of a local structure, average structure in a local way, I would say.
Yeah.
That only tells you that this smaller chlorine oxygen does happen.
Okay.
But how the
But how it's-
distribution, it's not, no. But I don't find a net polarization, so I believe that these are not really organized in a particular direction. Otherwise, I would have found some
No.
kind of a polarization.
Even if they are not organized, you should see in PDF at least.
I guess so. I have not
that
done
there
it.
is a distribution.
I understand, but I haven't done it.
Are there any more questions? Comment? Yes, please. Sushi.
It's a cobalt cobalt 3 in the tetrahedron.
Yes.
It's a Yantella ion.
Sorry?
Yantella ion. Well,
Yes,
distortion-
by counting cobalt 2 plus is a D7. It turns out to be cobalt 2 plus.
Cobalt 4 plus.
Cobalt 4 plus is D5, so it cannot be Anteller,
It cannot.
No.
So distortion cannot be.
not expected.
Okay, so thank you very much again, and we